Hi, I am Tannaz, the host for the Power of the Patient project. Today, my guest is Iris Waichler, has been licensed clinical social worker for over 40 years. Her specialty area has been medical social work, working with the patient with catastrophic illnesses, having spent many years working with hospital inpatients and their families as a counselor, helping them understand and cope with their diagnosis and resulting life changes. She has also spent many years working with older adults and their caregivers, and is the author of Role Reversal: How to Take Care of Yourself and Your Aging Parents. She's the recipient of 12 major book awards and has been doing workshops and seminars for the last 20 years, focusing on infertility and caregiving topics. She has also been a freelance writer for the last 20 years, authoring hundreds of articles on health-related topics. Thank you for joining us today, Iris. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tannaz.
I would like to start with the effects of pandemic that has been very challenging for our seniors. Many folks, especially the elderly, have experienced isolation, sickness, depression, anxiety during the pandemic. What has been the response of caregivers to deal with this mental health crisis, in your opinion?
Well, I would say it's both a mental health and a physical health crisis. And what you described is absolutely true. I would say another major issue for seniors was anxiety, because there was so much uncertainty. The people that may have been their caregivers no longer could be their caregivers because they were ill, or people that were coming into their home to take care of them couldn't be there as well. So there was a disruption in their life in terms of how things normally went, which caused anxiety, might cause some confusion and disorientation. The other interesting thing that happened was, for caregivers, the number of caregivers went way up by 10 million people. And one of the interesting aspects of that is, in the Family Caregiver Alliance just sent statistics out, people between the ages of 18 and 49 needed help and needed caregivers. So much younger than you would imagine. And that was up, that was up 8% from where it used to be. And the other piece of it was that a lot of the people that had been caregivers, the average age used to be 49, but people in their 20s and 30s had to step up. Millennials, God bless them, were able to step up and help with the caregiving responsibilities, because it became, it was so chaotic and it was so difficult, and there weren't any, the normal resources that were available just weren't available to people. The other interesting part about it, I think, you described the symptoms that seniors feel, and what happened to caregivers, 10 to 20% increase in complaints about their physical symptoms. Primarily, they had more headaches, they had more digestive issues because they were so worried and because they were so anxious. They had more body aches and physical complaints because they were doing more of the physical, direct contact kind of caregiving tasks. And the other piece of it was that they expressed a lot more complaints in terms of their mental health. So caregivers reported a lot more depression and a lot more anxiety and a lot more uncertainty. And those numbers went sky high when the pandemic happened. Again, because they didn't have the support that they needed as caregivers. And also, many of them were in the sandwich generation. So all of a sudden, they're having to take care of their kids and homeschool them while they're being caregivers for senior loved ones and other loved ones. And so they were extremely overwhelmed, and it was extremely challenging for them too. And then the other aspect, of course, that we all know is the financial stressors. People had lost their jobs, and also income was very uncertainty. And so some people who had financial resources to bring people in to help, all of a sudden that money dried up. So the responsibilities were on their shoulders as well. And that uncertainty about work was such a burden for so many people that it really contributed to the symptoms that I just described to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly that is very overwhelming and could cause a lot of struggle in mental health area, especially in pandemic. Now, therapy is very expensive. I mean, in some countries, it's very expensive. And
we're the worst. We're the worst here.
Yeah, it's not.
Our healthcare is just ridiculous.
Yes. So for those who are in desperate need of therapy, what other resources is available, especially for those who cannot afford therapy sessions?
Well, one thing I would say, and this is what I worked in a hospital for many years, and one thing I would say is if you have people that are leaving the hospital, I would like that hospitals brought someone, and this is what I did. I would go in, I worked with every patient that came on my unit and every family that came on my unit. I worked with people with catastrophic illnesses. But before they're discharged, I would have someone, either a social worker or a psychiatric nurse, someone that can do an assessment and talk with the person that's leaving to figure out what kind of help they might need or that they anticipate. And then give them information about resources and referrals so that they're not just thrown out of the hospital without any help or resources. Another thing that people discovered because of the pandemic and they couldn't get out of their homes was online help. We're so lucky here in this country in that there's so many online services where you can call 24 hours a day. And we spoke earlier about that isolation factor for the patients, but also for their families. So for example, the National Alliance for Mental Illness has a site that you can go on 24 hours a day where you can speak to a counselor. They also offer support groups. They also offer resources. They also offer educational programming. All of that is free. And also there are websites for caregivers too, like the Family Caregiver Alliance network and other places like that where you can get free online counseling and free online support groups. I think one of the toughest things about being a caregiver is you feel isolated and you feel alone and you feel like no one understands what you're going through and that what you're feeling is unique. And it's so important to connect with other people that are in a similar situation because it helps you feel less alone. And also it normalizes the feelings that you have. As caregivers, sometimes we feel guilty or inadequate, or sometimes we get frustrated, we get angry, and we feel there's something wrong with that, or that we're inadequate in some way. And connecting with other people who've had similar experiences can really, really be important for caregivers. And also, caregivers have tips for other caregivers too, and that's really important. For seniors too, locally, you can go to your area on aging office and they can give you information about resources and places where there's a sliding scale fee. Local mental health centers have sliding scale fees, and so that's another resource. And also senior centers are a real wealth of information in terms of programming and things that people can do. People that live in assisted living programs or skilled nursing programs, there's groups and counseling available there, and that's usually free as well. So there really are resources. And the beauty about the internet piece is too, a lot of people can't get out. Caregivers can't get out because they can't leave the person they're taking care of. And the people that need the care oftentimes they don't have the ability to move around a lot or get out. So those are really important and wonderful resources for both of them.
Well, that's great to know, especially for caregivers. Now, in the topic of caregivers, you actually wrote a book, Role Reversal: How to Take Care of Yourself and Your Aging Parents.
Right.
It's a common problem. Many elderly men and women, they're living with their children. And even if they're living alone, sometimes or most of the time they depend on their children. And being a caregiver, as you mentioned, it could create, it could burn you out, it could create anxiety. So based on your experience and your opinion, how can caregivers, whether you're children or whether you're professionally caregivers, to find that balance between self-care and taking care of the loved ones?
Yeah, it's really tough challenge. And I want to say I'm speaking to you from personal experience because I took care of my dad and my mom, and I also helped two friends of mine who were single and didn't have families. So a group of friends, our chosen family, we got together and helped take care of them. I think one of the biggest issues for caregivers is that they don't take care of themselves because they're focused on taking care of the person that they love. And so burnout happens. And so one of the most important things is you need to be aware of that as a caregiver and incorporate some techniques into your caregiving. The first is any caregiver needs to put a respite plan in place, and that means someone that will come in and offer you a break. And it's really important to do that because when we become caregivers, we can't always anticipate what's going to happen and the care needs of the loved one we're taking care of. And oftentimes, particularly with seniors, they get one medical problem and it cascades into many more. And all of a sudden, the physical and emotional and mental demands of caregivers increases. So it's really important to have that respite plan in place and for you to give yourself permission to take that break. And that break is super important for you as a caregiver and also the person being taken care of, because that recharges you as a caregiver. It nourishes your spirit, it nourishes your body and your mind. You can do things like exercise, things that bring you joy. It can be reading a book, it can be having a nice meal, it can be taking a walk, whatever brings you joy, hiding in the bathtub with bubbles, whatever. And also, you need to identify people in your life as a caregiver that you can go to and honestly talk about what you're experiencing, because it's really important to have that kind of an outlet too. Another thing that caregivers are really bad at is saying no. And it's really important to be able as a caregiver to say no if you're asked to do something that you know you can't do. And do that without guilt. Give yourself permission to do that. That's usually important. The other thing that happens with caregivers, and I mentioned at the beginning, all the symptoms that caregivers experience. So as caregivers, we need to pay attention to our body, the physical things going on with our body. When we lose sleep, or if it's hard to get out of bed when you want to hide under the covers, if you find yourself drinking more than you might have done before, if you find yourself feeling depressed, if you find yourself all of a sudden getting very angry or irritable, these are all signs. If you have more body aches, if you just don't have any energy at all, these are all signs that we have to pay attention to as caregivers. Our body and our minds are telling us that we're getting overwhelmed, and caregivers need to give themselves permission to address those issues. And it's a gift. It's a gift to the person you're taking care of too, because many times you're the only caregiver. And if you're burned out, then the person that you're taking care of is going to be out of luck as well. So, and the final thing I would say is it's really important to learn to ask for help when you need it as a caregiver. People are really reluctant to do that because they perceive it as a personal failure. I should be able to do this. Or they feel guilty going to somebody else, or they're afraid how the person they're taking care of is going to react to someone else getting involved. But sometimes as caregivers, we're asked to do things that we really don't know how to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, really important to be able to ask for help when you know you're in that situation.
Yeah, asking for help is very important to find that balance between yourself and the loved ones. Finally, I wanted to ask you this question because as a social worker, you work with patients with catastrophic illnesses, and I know that the diagnosis can be frightening. How do you work with these patients to ease their stress of the major illness, and what advice you offer to the families who go through the health crisis with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned before, when I was working in the hospital, I saw every patient that came on my unit, and they were truly catastrophic illnesses. They were head injuries and strokes and amputations and cancer and burns and neurological diseases. And so it was a total from one second to the other change. And one of the things that I learned as a social worker, as a person, and as an author is education is power, and it's very important. And I'll give you an example of that. I was walking on my unit one day, and I walked by my patient's room, and the resident, the doctor, was just in there, just giving him a standard EKG test. And his family was outside the room, and they were sobbing. And I went over to his family, and I said, What's wrong? And they mistakenly assumed that because he was getting this test, he was going to die. And so of course I explained to them that it was a standard test, but I thought to myself, oh my, if the anxiety that people feel, particularly in the middle of a catastrophic illness, you're so vulnerable when you're ill and when you see a loved one in pain and you see a loved one suffering. And so I was so struck by that. And I was also struck by the fact the resident didn't take the time to tell them what the test was, because that would have made all the difference in the world. They would have sat there patiently. And I ended up writing a book because of that. I wrote a book called Patient Power, How to Have a Say During Your Hospital Stay, because I felt that if people knew what questions to ask, it could empower them during these catastrophic times. So I spent a lot of time educating family members and patients about what to expect, what can they ask for in terms of help. And I also, the other thing that happened in our unit, it was really interesting because our patients came in, and as I said, they were very, very sick and in pretty bad shape, but they virtually, almost without exception, every single one of them left being able to do more for themselves, having more mobility, having the ability to do more in terms of taking care of themselves. And it was sort of reframing notions for them. A friend of mine came in my unit one day and he said to me, "This is a very depressing place. How do you work here?" And my team and I worked with a multidisciplinary team of nurses and physical therapists and speech therapists and occupational and the doctor and our beloved primary nurses. And our whole objective was to put that person back together again as whole as we could make them. And so my friend saw a wheelchair as a sign of something that was negative or depressing. My patients were thrilled to be able to get in that wheelchair and zip down the halls and go into the lounge. And so it was sort of reframing and changing the way they looked at things so that the wheelchair became a way to gain independence rather than a symbol of a limitation or a disability. So I think that's really important. And that's one of the things I would do in counseling with my patients and with their families, and also to help them get realistic expectations in terms of what the future holds. One of the toughest things that happens for caregivers is we lose people twice, particularly when we're taking care of beloved seniors. And that is, you see the person you knew change, and that person, that beloved person slips away physically and maybe mentally, and then you physically lose them again when they die. And so that's so hard. And the other piece of what I think is really important to help in these situations is to help the patients grieve, because it's a huge loss. And so you have to deal with the feelings of grief because they don't perceive themselves as the person they were. And sometimes you can't be back to where you were. So a lot of times what I did was I spent a lot of time working with families and patients in terms of dealing with that grief, and also helping patients and family members maximize the independence of the person too. It doesn't help someone to do everything for them and for things that they can do themselves. If you do that, their muscles weaken, their minds don't function as well.
Their confidence.
Everything. Self-esteem is such a huge part of all of this. And so it's such an amazing feeling when you stand up for the first time when you haven't been able to get out of bed. It feels like such an achievement. And so one of the other things that it's really important to do is to help people measure those gains, literally those footsteps. I had a very young woman come on my unit. She was like 32 years old, and she had something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is something very scary, which attacks different systems in the body. And she went from being a runner and a very active person, and they brought her in on a gurney. She couldn't even sit in a wheelchair. And as they were wheeling her in, she said to me, there's a race that they run. She was from Michigan. She said, "I'm going to run in that race next year." And I thought to myself, let's see what we can do to make that happen. And we did. She ran in that race. She left there. She walked out. She did the race, and she was just amazing. So it's helping people get from that beginning stage and seeing what's possible.
Well, Aris, you are definitely making a difference. What you do is very inspiring. and it's powerful. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for joining us today. We learned
Thank
so
you
much
for
from you.
having me. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.